Welcome to the third in our series of ancient history seminars on the theme of gender and sexuality from Olivia. Oh, and our hands is here, we can start. Dawdling out, waiting for his arrival on the theme of gender and sexuality from Livia to Theodora. And this week, having had two different approaches of our previous weeks, having had Beth's biographical approach and then Louise looking at the representations of women and how we might reconstruct gender roles and family structures from epigraphic material primarily. We have a third approach today, drilling down into the social history of women. It is my very great pleasure to introduce April, who was late of these parts before she fled north, back north perhaps I should say, first to Newcastle and then to Manchester Metropolitan. For those who do not remember her birthday days, I think the last time I ran a seminar, we ran it together, yes, which was one of the highlights of the Institute's intellectual life of the last 20 years at least. She's worked extensively on issues of demography and of family structure in Egypt, has recently been completing her much awaited book on that topic. Probably on that area, the paper in Holleran and Pudsey would be the one we'll point to first as being groundbreaking in familial structures and life course analysis. She's also been working with the Petrie Museum on the domestic artifacts and household materials in a really interesting project which is now moving towards publication. And so when we started on this series and we wanted to have this variety of approaches to the issues, April was one of the first names that occurred to us. So with no further ado, April on towards, not towards a social and cultural history of breastfeeding. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for the very warm welcome and for coming here on a drizzly afternoon to hear me talk about this topic. The title is Towards, Richard reminds me, Towards a Social and Cultural History of Breastfeeding in Antiquity, because that's what this paper represents. It's a step towards something that I don't think actually has been done for Antiquity yet. Now, breastfeeding is one of the most significant practices of human history, and I'm sure many people in this room won't need me to tell them that. It's in both biological and cultural terms. And as mammals, we lactate to ensure survival, health and protection. And as humans, we've always developed cultural behaviours around the practices of nursing our young. Nursing's not just a biological thing, it's a fundamental means of socialisation, both for the infant and the mother, or nurse, as well as being a provider of nourishment. And indeed, medical studies of breastfeeding at the moment, have long since demonstrated that there are physiological benefits for the infants, of course, to breastfeeding, but also for the mothers, especially shortly after giving birth. The physiological functions of breastfeeding, then, have been conceptualised quite differently across time and space in history, but also across different parts of the world at the moment. And as has this relationship between the biological aspect of being human and our responses and behaviours around its practice. And this is what makes breastfeeding a valid subject for historical research, in case you were wondering. It's not just something that's about individual practices, but about how humans behave culturally in these biological spheres. There are very few comprehensive or systematic book-length studies of breastfeeding in these terms for any periods of history, let alone for classical antiquity. And I've put a bibliography on the back. I'll refer to some of these items as we go through, but it's all there for reference. There are one or two items on the bibliography that offer shorter studies, on one particular social aspect of nursing, the use of wet nurses in the Roman and Islamic worlds. And there are one or two shorter studies on the representation of nursing mothers and nutrices, nurses in Roman art, funerary reliefs and votives. In terms of the physiological patterns of breastfeeding and weaning practices, it's the archaeologists, as usual, who are ahead of the ancient historians with various aspects of this, with studies of skeletal and dental evidence across the prehistoric Roman and Byzantine worlds, indicating through their work the dietary aspects of infant skeletons, which we'll talk about more shortly. But if we want to piece together a fuller picture of how Roman, however we might define that, individuals, social groups and communities conceptualised and practiced breastfeeding, we need a biocultural approach that takes into account a range of observed behaviours and their relationship with environmental, demographic and other physical circumstances and changing dynamics. And that's precisely what I'm working towards, because that's no mean feat, that's a big job, with a planned, much larger project where I'm hoping to systematically and comprehensively examine a range of epigraphic and papyrological and other material from across the Greek and Roman worlds relating to breastfeeding and nursing and wet nursing. So this afternoon's paper then is a kind of tentative first few steps in that general direction and focusing in large part on material from Roman Egypt with some background from other areas. And I have generally overall three overarching research questions. The first is, well, did women in the Roman world practice breastfeeding and weaning in broadly consistent ways in terms of ages of infants? At what point do they stop exclusively breastfeeding and start to wean children, infants? And in what ways were these practices a response to any environmental or cultural circumstances or social or economic circumstances even? So how are those two connected? The second is, what do breastfeeding behaviours tell us about the lived experience of women's lives and indeed of children's lives as well? Can we see distinctly Roman or Greco-Roman practices in this regard across the empire or the Roman world? We can look at things in relation to the rights and opinions of usually elite males on how women should be using their bodies. That happens today, no surprises there. The third question is, what are the social, cultural and physiological implications that led to and were influenced by alternative supplies of human milk, alternative that is to the infant's mother? So animal milk, but also nurse's milk. What were the considerations around using nurse's milk? Was that a good thing in terms of social status or economics? Was it seen in different ways? How effective and prominent was it? So with all these questions in mind, we can explore what we can know, or what we can start to know about the physiology of breastfeeding and weaning, and the emotional and familial concerns around nursing mothers or nursing nurses, and the emotional and social importance of wet nursing in a society where wet nursing seems to have been broadly, quite widely practiced. So, the physiological and biological and emotional aspects of breastfeeding are considered equally important to infant and maternal health and well-being. Feeding is a bonding as well as a provision of nourishment. So it's a source of human and mammal life-giving and a crucial means of bonding and socialisation. And these issues lie at the heart of medical and social comment on whether biological mothers ought to breastfeed their own infants. And we see, as I've mentioned, across the Roman world, even studies by Keith Bradley back in the 1980s talked about evidence for breastfeeding by both mothers and wet nurses being ubiquitous across the Roman world. The focus of a lot of the scholarship that deals with these practices is largely centred on one aspect or another, either the biological aspects or the social aspects. But anyway, we know from medical writers in the Roman world that there was a lot of acquaintance with some of the physiological implications for infants, in particular the terms of duration of exclusive breastfeeding and weaning onto animal milk and foods. So in handout 1A and B on page 1, I've just given you some snippets which I won't read out, and I'm not projecting them at you because it's all on the handout. It's easy to read, I think. So Serenus talks about the fact that a wet nurse should be used to provide milk for the first few days after birth because a mother's milk is unwholesome. That's Serenus's opinion. But then, of course, goes on to talk about how the mother's milk is more important later on and much better than a nurse's milk. And he goes on to talk about how to choose a wet nurse. And of course, there are people in this very room with the medical expertise to know whether or not that's the case. Galen also talks about which kinds of, whether mother's milk is better or a wet nurse's milk. And this is, of course, these elite male kind of ideas and opinions about what women should do with their breasts, essentially. And of course, I could talk a lot about how these issues come up in debates around breastfeeding today. But of course, some of these debates relate to issues of whether you should breast or bottle feed babies for various reasons, or whether you should do so in public or in private to appease all the Nigel Farages who seem to get upset by public breastfeeding. These are all very kind of socially concerns and moral concerns dressed up as a kind of biological concern. And to some extent that's what we see in some of these medical texts and certainly in some of the other texts as well. But anyway, recent archaeological research has actually contributed to our understanding of how far these patterns that Serenus and Galen outline have actually seemed to have been happening. So there's lots of archaeological research that basically supports their contention that babies should be breastfed exclusively with human milk, however that comes to them, for the first 3 months of life, and then they should introduce animal milk and still continue to be breastfed in conjunction with that until they're 3 years old. Sorry. And this seems to be broadly consistent. The archaeological material seems to demonstrate that. What is this archaeological material? Well, lots of the infant skeletal remains assessed by Pearson, Duprat, Prowse and Fuller et al., that are all on the Bibliography, give a sense of how we can understand these weaning practices. Various items that I've referred to there offer bioarchaeological approaches to understanding feeding and weaning patterns through the use of stable isotope studies, whereby they assess the level of carbon and nitrogen isotopes in the collagen of bones of infant skeletons in cemeteries. There aren't very many of these samples around the Roman world, but as I say, the ones that have been studied, the conclusions are broadly consistent with what Serenus and Galen say. So for instance, the infant skeletal remains from the Dakhla oasis in Egypt have been subject to stable nitrogen isotope analysis, and that gives you a sense of the proportions of animal and human protein in the bones, in the bone collagen. And this demonstrates that supplementary foods were introduced at around 6 months of age and that weaning was completed by 3 years of age. And we see similar studies from early Neolithic cemeteries in central and southeastern Turkey, and allowing historians to explore this relationship between duration of exclusive breastfeeding and infant mortality. And this has actually shown that mortality rates amongst infants varied as a function of the duration of exclusive breastfeeding. So the longer the period of exclusive breastfeeding, the greater the risk of infant death. So the introduction of animal milk seems to have had a positive effect on reducing risks for children. But of course we see similar in other cemeteries, particularly in Kellis. We see a case where if that kind of nutrition just isn't available, then the opposite happens. So there we see the introduction of milk from goats or cows that have been fed on millet after 6 months, and breastfeeding continues until 3 years of age, but there's an increased mortality in that area, partly because various different resources were not available. So there's a complicated relationship between the environment, the resources, and this duration of exclusive breastfeeding. There are also lots of unanswered questions. We see, as Rebecca Dowland has shown in some of her work on this, that there are sex differences. There seems to be a tendency in some of the samples she's looked at for a preference for feeding male babies for longer periods as exclusively breastfed. There's also a problem with the mortality bias, in that you are looking at skeletal remains in a cemetery, so there's no sense that you can't tell whether that's representative of a whole community or not. But broadly, the patterns do seem to demonstrate that when communities are unaware of the optimal exclusive breastfeeding and weaning periods and the various different aspects of the resources available, the health and survivability of infants was at risk in some senses. And this is something, I won't talk too much about infant mortality because it's not a pleasant topic, but also it's something I've talked about in other areas. But it's something that we do know a lot about in terms of behavioural responses to risks or perceived risks in infant health. And we do know that from familial records and census data from Roman Egypt, that the heightened awareness of high infant mortality led to married couples making certain decisions about their reproductive patterns and so on. So birth spacing and increased fertility were individual responses to these patterns. So what can we say, moving on to the more emotional and cultural aspects of this topic, from the perspective of infants, or once they've grown up? We do have a wealth of epigraphic material from across the Roman world, revealing the extent of young adults and their families' emotional bonds with their previous nurses. There is a lot of evidence in terms of funerary art for nursing mothers and how they were reviewed, but nurses seem to come up quite a lot in a lot of the texts. So we're quite privileged with a large amount of epigraphic material, and I've just given you one or two examples on here that demonstrate clearly emotional relationships, but also these things are complicated by the presence of slavery and the fact that some of these nurses, most of them, were slaves. So in handout 2, there are some excerpts from CIL, from Rome and Italy, demonstrating the nutrices being commemorated by their former nurslings. You can look through those. I'm conscious of time, so I won't read through them. But we also have this issue of milk siblings as well. So, and I've given you some examples of that from CIL. There's quite a few of these. This doesn't seem to be a unique, odd thing. There's quite a lot of these inscriptions referring to milk siblings, so young people who've been nursed by the same nurse or someone who is a mother to one of these children. So we have that in those 3 examples, moving over onto page 2. And we can talk about those in the questions after, if you like. So we have this issue of the conlactus. We've got this kind of shared milk relationship, a sibling relationship that seems to be represented in very emotive ways on these inscriptions. So we're thinking about nurses and mothers. What were the views in terms of socioeconomic perspectives from the nurse's perspective? What was the advantage of becoming a nurse or of using a nurse? How was that viewed or conceptualised by different people? And of course the Roman elite texts give us one sense, and there's some quite famous passages from Tacitus there In every domus, they grow up naked and filthy, talking about the German tribes, and the mother breastfeeds her own children. They're not even handed over to a servant woman, nurses. Some quite contradictory kind of ideas about whether or not it's more socially acceptable in different circles to have your nurse, have your children fed by a nurse. And he goes on in the dialogue on oratory to talk about a similar thing as well. Juvenal refers to women of a certain social status in his misogynistic diatribe that is Satire 6, talking about nurses are the people who have this kind of station forced upon them or pressed on them. It's not something anyone would want to be. And of course, just for fun, the bit from Porphyry talking about a young man who seems to have been too close to his nanny or his nurse and remains so and is criticised for it in political life. Kind of like your Jacob Rees-Mogg kind of character there. What about then outside of these kind of elite perspectives on wet nurses? What kind of image do you have of them from more ordinary circles or different levels of what you might call elite groups? On page 3 of the handout, I've just put another couple of inscriptions of from ordinary inscriptions. So for the first one, to Grazia Alexandria, outstanding in her character and chastity, she even also raised her children with her own breasts. So again, we have a sort of contradictory kind of message that it's better to feed your own children and nurse your own children. But how far in reality is that feasible? We know that there were demographic pressures and environmental concerns, and of course biological concerns, that there were circumstances such as a lack of a mother or a lack of milk from a mother, and various different statuses involving enslaved people. So it wasn't always the case that there was a simple choice to be made. It wasn't a moral issue, but a practical and even a cultural one. Various uses of wet nurses seem to be more and more prominent across Egypt. And when we look at the material systematically and go through the papyri, we get a kind of opposite picture of wet nurses. They seem to have been quite well thought of and of a slightly higher status, and certainly very rarely ever were they slaves. Wet nursing. So we see this as a very important role in a society where children and infants from the moment they were born were at constant risk, and their survival was dependent on a nurse. We have from the census data an overabundance of female slaves in various parts, various rural and urban settings in the census material. I've written about this elsewhere, indicating the picking up of lots of young infants for the purpose of enslaving them. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this practice of infant exposure was a very clear means of supplying slaves. And of course those infants would then need to be nursed. So the issue of slavery and wet nurses in Roman Egypt from the evidence is inextricably linked up to one another. If a mother stopped producing milk and there were no alternatives, wet nurses were the next best thing. So we see that in evidence everywhere, but we see it particularly in the case of foundlings. On handout 3A, I've given you an example of a letter written by Valeria and Thamuthas to Thamuthion. She's pressing a relative, a sister, to go and collect a child that they know, or they seem to know. It's very difficult to see what's going on in this document. To go and collect this child and nurse her or nurse the child, and the implication is that, well, it's very unclear what the implication is. I did at one point think that was going to be raised as a slave, but there seems to be a bit of a discussion around that even within this short letter. But people are writing to one another about these things. This is just a snippet of a private letter where we see that kind of discussion going on. But if we look at the documentary papyri for evidence of wet nurses being employed or something going wrong with their employment in some way, we get a really clear sense of how this practice seems to have worked. So, for instance, in the large village or town of Tab-Tunis, we have a register of various contracts, so not just the odd contract here and there, but a collection of contracts that were all archived and kept together, and this documents an abstract of them. And lots of these documents were collected by Montevecchi and Maschiadri in 1984. There are 40-something of them, just over 40. And what we see from those documents is that the large proportion of infants who were wet nursed in these contracts were slaves or given slave status because they'd been found, they were foundlings, but most of the nurses were not slaves. So very few of the nurses themselves were slaves. So this was free women taking up a contract of employment as a wet nurse. So on page 3, I've listed some of these as we go through. So from Tab-Tunis under B is the register of contracts issued. I've given you the reference for that. And some details of contracts and receipts for wet nurses' wages. These were primarily foundlings, as I say. And in handout C, from another Tab-Tunis document from the 2nd century, we have a receipt for a wet nurse's wages. So a contract had been issued. Then Kebkis here, she's the nurse. She's in this written document acknowledging receipt from one Isidorus of 500 drachma of silver and wages for expenses of her female slave Serapias to nurse the child of Isidorus. So this is someone who is renting out her slave and charging, so that's a bit of a weird situation, she's charging and collecting the receipt for those wages. And there are some other similar contracts referring to a doula, a female slave or nursemaid, and in some cases, I think some of those have been mislabelled as slaves. A trophos in some cases as well, a nurse. And out of all of these documents, only 6 of these individuals are listed as being born already into slave families. But most of them are specifically listed as foundlings. So we've got a situation here where free women in Roman Egypt were in a position to engage in what might be termed a wage labour activity. That might be stretching it a bit, but that's for discussion maybe, in a way that was determined largely by themselves. And I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. The ways in which women contributed to and shaped economic activity were often quite restricted, of course, in antiquity, as in later periods, in the medieval period as well. The restrictions were placed not so much on their activity, but on their ability to legally accumulate wealth or capital. What we do have is some similar contracts from medieval Egypt and some Islamic texts from the 11th to the 15th century that are put together by Maya Schatzmiller on the Bibliography. And in some of these cases, we can use these Islamic texts to give us an indication of what's missing from these ones in the Roman period. The ones that we have from the Roman period give women a relative freedom to shape their own economic kind of activity. There are legal provisions entitling women in Roman Egypt anyway to exercise property owning and transactions. There are various socio-economic systems in place to help them implement these rights, as long as they frequently act with a guardian in their documents, which often is a kind of notional guardian in many cases. In terms of the Islamic text, there are cultural and religious attitudes and practicalities impeding women to act freely and preventing them from engaging in this activity. property rights and law are supported through their husbands. And in the cases of the legal documents from the Islamic period, it's the husbands making the contract. And there's a separation of husbands' and wives' property rights. But here, we see there's no such conflict between husbands' rights and husbands' ownership and capital and women. In fact, there very rarely is any mention of any men in these documents at all. There seems to have been a flexible system of women's rights for property ownership, as I said, and they were legally permitted to engage in lots and lots of different types of transactions, and frequently did so, as we see from lots of the documentary evidence. So, the only real impediment was the permission required of a kurios, a guardian, but sometimes even these guardians were other women. So in Roman Egypt, where lactation was not so much a legal or moral obligation of a mother or a woman, but was more typically a contracted and demanded service rendered by women, what was the balance of obligations, powers, freedoms, and earning potential through all of this as well. So we've got lots more of these documents that we could talk about. Over the page, on page 5, document D. And I've listed in the handout lots of other references for those who were specifically listed as foundlings who've been picked up and reared by these women. We see in this document an infant being picked up from the garbage dump, which is the phrasing used. So the wet nurse contract here is between the woman and she's agreeing to nurse a slave child that has been picked up and collected as a foundling. The contract is between her and the person, presumably a slave trading capacity, making this arrangement. There's a mention of her husband as guardian, and the contract though is most definitely with her. There's a smaller number of similar documents suggesting wet nurses were employed to nurse free children who were going to remain free, and I've listed those underneath there, but mostly they were these foundlings. There's an example under number E of nursing of a free child as well. The widespread presence of wet nurses then is indicative of a response to the difficulties in ensuring that free infants, as well as these foundlings, survive some of the risks inherent in the general feeding and weaning practices. But either raising or selling infants on as slaves seems to have led, and I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say, to a more systematic practice of employing nurses under quite formal and relatively standardised contracts to nurse slave infants or collections of slave infants for a period of time for an amount of money and provisions of olive oil and clothing and so on and so on. This seems to have been happening on quite a frequent basis. The economic value of these wet nurses is very clear, and often they would have had multiple infants that they were raising as well. There were various restrictions, but not many, placed on some of these nurses. This has been pointed out by Keith Bradley. But this is another area where there's a difference with later Islamic contracts, because again, we see there isn't a necessity for the husband's involvement here, and in the Islamic contracts we see evidence that the woman who was wet nursing was required not to have sex with her husband. In these texts, which are very few and far between, these sexual restriction texts, she's required not to have sex with anybody. It's not even the husband that's mentioned. So we have that. There never seems to be a requirement that she not feed other infants. And that's of course because if someone's a wet nurse, they presumably will have their own infants as well. And we see in some of these documents an indication of what's happening with these other infants, who's feeding them. Is there a kind of circulation of infants being fed? Where is all of this happening? we see this, of course, when things go wrong in some of these cases. So in both of these examples, the sexual restrictions are in place, but there's also a clause in the first one to say what will happen if the infant dies or should die in the care of that wet nurse. And the answer is she'll be given another one to nurse. And that seems to be quite prominent, and that seems quite a brutal kind of response to the death of an infant, but that's contracted in these documents. So there seems to be a supply of infants needing to be nursed, and the fact that these are written into these contracts suggests that it was a common issue, of course, that some infants wouldn't survive with the wet nurse. We also have, forgive the rather shoddy cut and paste job on page 7, a couple of Oxyrhynchus papyri that I love showing to students and trying to get them to figure out what's going on. But of course it's a horrible situation. This is 2 documents, 1 year apart, where there seems to have been, the nurse has been nursing an infant, and she has her own infant, and again we get a sense of this, her own infant being involved in this situation. The person who's contracted her has made the claim that that one of the infants has died, and that this nurse has switched the infants around, and he's claiming that her own infant, her own child has died, and she's just claiming to him that it's his foundling that's died. And of course then this is resolved by the local official on the basis that the infant looks like the mother, the surviving infant, so he grants that you know, she's not trying to rip off or you know, whatever. And then the following year, the next document comes back. It's the husband of this wet nurse complaining that although this was being dealt with, there's lots of kind of comeback from it, and his business is suffering. So that's the first involvement we have from the husband of someone who's wet nursing, when accusations are ruining his business a year later. And of course we don't know, these are just 2 snippet documents of a situation, we don't know any of the circumstances around this, but what we can see is that we get a sense of this, a woman has got multiple infants that she's nursing as well as her own. There's a suspicion around what happens when an infant has died. Why he's complaining, was it his own, was it a foundling that he was like anticipating raising as a slave that's died, or was it in fact his own child that he was entrusting to a wet nurse who's died? And is this really the way these issues were sorted out? It seems quite an kind of systematic way to resolve this kind of issue. So as often with these kind of disputes in papyri, this could all be about something else even, and this is just a way in. So, even from this sparse material, just collecting it all together, we can infer that women in Roman Egypt were able to use wet nursing as a means of some kind of legal and financial autonomy, and the social and demographic circumstances provided a clear framework for this, and perhaps even necessitated it. But what were the cultural barriers to this type of wage earning? We do see in quite a few other cases, I've not put them on the handout, but we do see wet nurses in these given the same treatment as some of the kind of emotional and caring attitudes we see in a lot of the inscriptions from around Italy. So in documents from Oxyrhynchus, we see the nurse of a man's children being left a legacy in his will. She's part of the family, part of the household, and she's being left things in the will, even though she doesn't live with them anymore. And we see these kinds of issues being resolved in these kinds of ways. And if you compare that with the text that I've given you at the bottom of page 7, from a wet nursing contracts translated by Maya Schatz Miller, and I'll leave you to read that, but it's very different in tone. It's an instruction of how to form one of these contracts. The contract is between the wife's husband, the wet nurse's husband, and there's no such kind of concern for the nurse's position what should happen if an infant should die, what kind of payment, and all these kinds of things. And it does seem from the contracts and various aspects of what comes out of other documents in Egypt that actually a lot of the emphasis was in the favour of the wet nurse. And, you know, it seems to me that the wet nurse was in a very privileged position in that sense. So that's just a taster of some of the Egyptian material. And of course, there's the usual question of how far this will have applied around the Roman world where we don't have this kind of material. And that's a job for the bigger project that I want to do. And they're not going to be papyri like that and contracts from everywhere, but I'd quite like to look at a lot of the epigraphic material as well. And if we go back to the first three questions that I asked, well, did women in the Roman world practice breastfeeding in consistent ways and weaning and so on? And how were they in response to environmental and cultural circumstances? Well, I think it's clear that the use of wet nurses in particular, either formally through a paid sort of system, systematically like that, is a response to the need for, in a high mortality, high fertility population, the need for milk, where mother's milk isn't enough. But actually that has to go along hand in hand with the understanding of where that's useful, and it seems quite scanty, some of the evidence to fit together. The second question is, what do breastfeeding behaviours tell us about the lived experience of women and even children? And do we see Roman practices across the empire? Well, I've just pointed to that. This women's experience in Egypt seems to give them, especially for nurses, a bit more of an autonomous position than they might otherwise have had. And certainly that they might not get to the same degree in other parts of the empire. And thirdly, what are the social, cultural and physiological implications that led to or were influenced by alternative supplies of human milk and that of the infant's mother? So an alternative supply of milk through the wet nurse, but also we've got evidence from around the Roman Empire, the Roman world, of people feeding their sisters' children and so on and so forth. You know, this happens, this still happens around the world today. And there are various kind of moral objections or medical objections, and everyone has an opinion on that kind of thing. And in particular, there's in developing world countries, the establishment of milk banks is a very important development. So there's lots of questions still to answer, and I think that by looking at Egypt and in this material, but also branching out with these kind of questions in mind, we can do more work on trying to put together a social and cultural history of breastfeeding from the perspectives of women and infants, but also of married couples who had children as well. And we can see things that relate to broader communities and civic identity. So for instance, just a quick look at some of the inscriptions on PHI from various regions of the Greek world. I found some inscriptions that seem to be dedicated to wet nurses in relation to their civic community with quite a high station, and not exactly state funerals, but moving towards that. So we see those kinds of things, and that's something I want to look at a bit more. There's also religious factors to look at as well, particularly in Egypt, where we've got the divine wet nurse, and around the Roman world, the deonatrices and so on. And that's something that can be looked at with a lot of the visual and artistic material as well. So lots of work to do, but I hope I've given you a snippet of how I can try to begin to move towards a cultural history of breastfeeding in Antiquity. Thank you.